Hello, and welcome to Public Key, the new podcast from Chainalysis. This is your host, Ian Andrews. The Lazarus Group is a notorious North Korean team of cybercriminals who've been implicated in such exploits as the 2014 Sony Pictures breach, the 2016 attempt to steal $1 billion from Bangladesh Bank, and the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack. Most recently, they've been implicated in the $625 million cryptocurrency theft from Axie Infinity's Ronin bridge. On this episode, I'm joined by someone that's followed Lazarus Group closely for years, investigative journalist and author Geoff White. We discuss the origins of Lazarus Group and the amazing stories from his podcast and upcoming book, Lazarus Heist. Finally, if I didn't see you in person at the Chainalysis Links Conference in New York City, I have good news. You can find links to video recordings of all the amazing content in the show notes. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Geoff White, who, if you follow the cybersecurity industry, the world of the dark web and state-sponsored hackers, his name is probably very familiar to you. You might have actually even listened to his podcast covering the organization known as Lazarus. He's got a new book coming out soon, which we're going to chat about. I am fascinated by your work, Geoff. Thanks for agreeing to come on the podcast and talk with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I always like to start on this podcast talking a little bit about people's cryptocurrency origin story. You've been in this longer than most. When did you first encounter crypto as a topic, and what led you to dive deep into that world and start reporting on it?
Yeah. I suppose I was in on crypto fairly early, at least Bitcoin fairly early. We covered Silk Road, the infamous dark web Tor site. And through that, obviously started finding out about this new currency, Bitcoin. Before Silk Road, I hadn't come across Bitcoin. So the two revelations of Tor and Bitcoin came along once. And really, it just kept cropping up in so many of the investigations that I did, because it just became the currency of choice for that entire sort of dark web underground economy. It's led to some quite entertaining instances. At one point discovered an old Bitcoin wallet that I'd set up, because people forget, when Bitcoin first started out, it was worthless. It was basically worthless initially. And, I'd obtained some Bitcoin for our Channel 4 News investigations. I was working for Channel 4 News at the time, and had made purchases on the dark web. There is, by the way, a legal get out. If you are obtaining drugs and possessing drugs for the purpose of instantly disposing of them, then you're very, very unlikely to be prosecuted. So this is, for example, if teachers confiscate drugs from their pupils, or for a journalistic drug buying mission to test whether these sites actually did sell drugs. We did make some purchases. Therefore, I did get some Bitcoin. So I set up some wallets, and I would have expensed that Bitcoin back to Channel 4 News, for whom I was working at the time, and then came across the wallets years later. And I did say to my partner, I said, I've come across half a Bitcoin. And she said, well, how much is that worth? And at the time, it was something like £6,000. And her eyes sort of widened. And then I looked again and said, oh, no, I must have spent all that on heroin. So there are some quite entertaining instances. But also, I want to just bookend this by the fact that I have resisted for a very, very long time investing any money in Bitcoin, because I just feel that as a journalist, I need to stay independent. I need to stay neutral. I finally cracked in the past year, I think it was, and thought, I'm going to put some money into Bitcoin, because as an asset class, it does quite well. It is appreciating. Yeah. It seems a sensible choice. Lots of other people are doing it. Since that day, the price has gone just down and down and down. And then recently, in the last couple of days, we've obviously had a big event. So I think basically I've killed it. I'm so sorry.
You were the precipitating cause of the market downturn, the all-time high, and then you invest.
As soon as I put in, sorry, that's it. That's it, folks. It's all downhill from here.
I hope it's not easy to discover your address. There's a lot of angry cryptocurrency investors who may be coming your way now, having that knowledge that you were the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. That's amazing. Also, your story about money spent on drugs, much better than the gentleman who spent a few hundred Bitcoin on pizza.
One of the problems with cryptocurrency is it's really difficult to appreciate the beginnings of it, because we look back at it through the current era when it's worth loads and it's well developed. You cannot understand. It's very hard to understand, I think, for most people, how it started out. It was funny money. It was almost joke money for a lot of people. So yeah, it's interesting.
It is amazing, and I didn't actually buy any drugs on any darknet markets, but I do recall early looks at cryptocurrency where kind of like just passing as a interested technologist. And I said, this is never going to take off. This is like a very small group of people who have an interesting sort of side project, and it's going to fizzle out and go away. So I've been consistently wrong on that, to the point that I actually had to come and join a company operating in the space because I capitulated fully. Um, so the early days into cryptocurrency, also early days in to this organization known as Lazarus.
Mm.
Re-listening to your podcast this morning, I don't know about the audience, but I had sort of forgotten that the sort of severity of the hack that Sony Pictures experienced and the lead up to that. But at the time, this was one of the biggest sort of cyber crimes to hit a major corporation.
Yeah, it was huge. It was huge, and it was high profile as well. This wasn't bank or financial institution or whatever. This was Sony. A lot of this again makes sense. Like Bitcoin, actually makes sense in hindsight. So I will be the first to admit, when the Sony hack happened and the US came out and publicly blamed North Korea so quickly, I was skeptical, and I was phoning contact saying, "Come on, why? What's the attribution here?" And it really took 4 years for that attribution to fully be fleshed out. There was a 2018 indictment from the US against a North Korean individual who they said is part of the Lazarus Group, and in that you suddenly get all of the detail that the US alleges was behind this hack. But at the time, all we knew was Sony had been hacked and somebody had done it. But what was astonishing, again in hindsight, about this was that previously hackers had hacked information and dumped it, and that's kind of how, to a certain sense, still how it works. With the Sony hack, it was one of these amazing instances where the hackers worked out what they'd got, broke it up into chunks, and then released those chunks in a very, very clearly defined order, which was going to lead up to a crescendo, which is exactly how journalists work. When we get a leak of information, we don't just dump it all in one day's paper or program. We eke it out over the course of a week, and we make the pain worse and worse and worse for the target of the investigation. The hackers did exactly the same. They were after the two people who headed up Sony, Michael Linton and Amy Pascal, and they worked up to that crescendo like a sort of performance piece almost. It was frightening in hindsight, and that goes alongside all the destructive malware that they dropped on Sony that crippled thousands of their computers and reduced them to working on paper and pens. Even fax machines didn't work in Sony. It was absolutely astonishing.
I mean, they even managed to shut down the coffee shop. Was the the detail?
Somebody on the investigation I spoke to said that the payroll system obviously was shafted
Yeah.
as well. So people were sort of having to queue in the car park to have checks written out for them. I had this impression that you'd queue up and they'd say, "Well, how much is your normal monthly salary?" And you say, "Oh, it's X thousand dollars." Somebody would write you out a little check and hand it to you. And you go to thank. Not sure whether that's quite how it happened, but payroll was everything, as you say. Coffee shops, the lot. The doors didn't work. It was mayhem. That's it, mayhem.
The technical sophistication, I think I had come to expect, right? Like you have people building software, and then you have people who can kind of find the vulnerability and exploit it. But this is the first attack that I can remember that had this coordinated sophistication on how it unfolded. Like they were maximizing for damage to Sony's brand and reputation. They had identified people that they felt personally offended the regime, and they went after them directly. There was a lot of thought and planning that went into this.
There was, but also you have to realize that was going on in terms among a general milieu of computer hacking becoming more advanced, and data leaks and reputational damage becoming more targeted. The anonymous group point was rampaging around the internet, doing very strategic leaks of information and really targeting organizations. So yes, it was very sophisticated, but that was also a reflection of what was happening in cyber at the time, and still does to a certain extent. It was a very, very well-planned case of that sort of reputational damage and strategic leaking instances.
One of the things that you allude to early in the podcast is that in some ways, Lazarus fell out of the fact that North Korea had become so isolated from the global financial system because of sanctions related to their nuclear ambitions and a variety of other things they had done. Um, is that a reasonable summary in your opinion? Like Lazarus happened because North Korea had to find capacity to fund the economy, basically, and electronic theft became an obvious target, right?
But you talk about sanctions on a country, and there are sanctions on North Korea. And as you say, those sanctions have come about because of North Korea's belligerent and obstinate continuation of missile and nuclear tests. The reason North Korea does all of that is to maintain a seat at the international table. The reason frankly, the reason a lot of politicians care about North Korea is because it's a nuclear power. And North Korea knows that and will not let go of that thing. Now, the awful cost of that is that the sanctions come about because of that. When you actually look at those sanctions and how much pressure it puts North Korea under, it is almost impossible for North Korea to sort of buy or sell anything. I mean, it can't. The way other countries work, the way the US, the way the UK, the way these countries work economically, we make stuff and we sell it. We provide services. None of it's available to North Korea. There's almost no way for this country to function economically, and that's part of the reason, I guess, for the sanctions. So North Korea's had to look at different other ways. They've had to look at things like smuggling, and I'm not, expressing a sympathy for that. It's still illegal activity, but it's forged out of this desperation for money. The computer hacking that they're doing is to top up the government's coffers, and that's led North Korea into a really interesting position, which I think is really worth looking at in terms of how other nation states are working with organized cybercrime, because North Korea's hackers, if the allegations against them are correct, are hacking into banks and cryptocurrency exchanges and all that stuff that we'll probably come on to talk about. They're also having to work alongside organized cybercrime and organized street crime in some cases to launder that money and to acquire that money and to use and move that money. So suddenly you get nation state hackers working with organized cybercrime. That's worrying, but that's a trend that's happening more and more. More and more governments are starting to work either through or with or behind the cover of organized cybercrime for a whole bunch of reasons. It gives them, the organized cybercrime gangs have the tools, they have the infrastructure, but also it's palpable deniability. If you can hide behind an organized cybercrime group as a government, well, that allows you to get away with stuff that otherwise you might get caught and called out for. So the furrow that North Korea is ploughing in this, I feel, is a furrow that a lot of other people are going to start ploughing it, and probably already are.
We see it with, I think 75% of the ransomware attacks originate by groups that are primarily in Russia. And so they're kind of operating, if not directly state sponsored, at least under an umbrella of protection provided by the Russian government.
That's long been the accusation, yeah.
One of the interesting stories in the podcast, it's a little far afield of our normal topics here, is real money laundering. This Supernote, I had not heard this story before, but it seems like a volume of $100 bills that were counterfeit for over a long period of time were originating out of North Korea. Like they were just printing their own US currency.
Yeah, exactly. The Superdollar story is really interesting, and I'll be honest, I was a bit lukewarm about putting it in the podcast, and also therefore into the book that I've written off the back of the podcast. Our producer Estelle, who's fantastic producer at the BBC, she said, "Look, it's a really interesting story," and I'm so glad that she did, because yeah, the accusation is that North Korea, as it started to run out of money, and this is after the Great Famine in the mid 1990s, it was a horrific famine hit the country, and the country really got very close, I think, to hitting the buffers at that point. Obviously needed ways of making money and had a printer, had paper for banknotes. And so the allegation is decided to start printing $100 bills, the so-called superdollars. The amazing thing about these dollars is they're actually better in some cases than the real thing. The printing is a little bit sharper in some cases. The thing is, once you get into the mechanics of all this, it's very difficult to do. You need the right paper. For a start, to print on, because the US obviously makes the right paper, and if you try and use paper that's not right, the Americans will spot it in a heartbeat. So you need the right paper, you need the right ink, you need the right printer. North Korea's diplomats and officials have been caught on multiple occasions with these counterfeit notes. Now, the North Korean response to this is, look, we're not counterfeiting. One of their arguments to say, well, look, because we're cut off from the international financial community, our diplomats and officials just end up with these banknotes. We have a lot of cash because we have to have cash. And so inevitably, we're going to end up with more counterfeit cash. You'd have to be hella unlucky to end up with the quantity of counterfeit $100 bills they've ended up with. So the idea is, well, North Korea is printing them. There is not, I will say, there's not video evidence of Kim Jong-il standing over a big printing press, reeling out notes. People who've investigated on the part of the US are convinced North Korea was the source of these banknotes. And it was a hugely destabilizing issue for the United States and led to a couple of absolutely astonishing undercover operations to try and crack down on this, in which FBI officers pretended to be criminals and then pretended to have wedding parties and invited their accomplices along and then arrested them at the wedding. It was proper narco stuff. It was really amazing.
People need to read the book or listen to the podcast to catch that whole story. I agree. It's just, it reads like a movie script. in terms of the sequence of events playing out. I was smiling the whole time re-listening to the podcast this morning, just thinking about it. Almost sounds unbelievable, but it actually happened, right? You can go on the FBI website and find photos of the wedding invite and things like that.
I mean, this is the thing. The Sony case, the Superdollars case, yes, they are astonishing and they are entertaining. We just got to consider the backdrop to them, which is this is a country where 25 million people are experiencing desperate poverty at the moment, potentially experiencing a COVID outbreak, which is very, very worrying, and also repressed by an incredibly oppressive dictatorial government. So you've always got to kind of keep it in the back of your mind that there is a serious hinterland to this. But you're right, some of these stories just do feel like they've been taken out of a Hollywood script.
They really do. And I mean, the other one that I was just going to mention in the history is this Bangladesh bank heist, which had they actually managed to pull it off completely, would have been one of the largest thefts ever, right?
This was, I think, in terms of a single cyber criminal theft, they went after $951 million. And so, had they pulled it off, pretty sure that would have been the largest single one-off, single attack amount. There's other cybercrime groups, including Lazarus, who've made billions over the years in different attacks in different ways. But I'm talking about one hit, one attack, one amount. They didn't get that amount of money for a whole bunch of intriguing reasons, which we can go into, including spelling mistakes and so on. But coincidences that cost them a lot of money. So that was what they went after, $1 billion. And it's worth noting Bangladesh Bank is the central financial institution of Bangladesh. It's like the Bank of England, basically. It's the country's central repository of money. So an extremely high profile target and a ballsy target to go after, let's face it.
It seems like the Lazarus hasn't slowed down from that point, right? I mean, we've been watching them in the context of cryptocurrency theft. Our analysis suggests, last year they stole several $100 million in cryptocurrency, primarily targeting smaller exchanges, not $1 billion hit. But then earlier this year, it appears that the popular cryptocurrency video game platform Axie Infinity, they were compromised, and the current evidence seems to point to Lazarus made off with about 600 million in currency. So they're stepping up efforts here.
Again, I think that is actually the largest single one-off amount of money stolen in a single cyber attack. I mean, it's also worth just bearing in mind, because the value of cryptocurrency, as we know, goes up and down quite a lot. So, the Mt. Gox raid will now be worth many, many orders of magnitude more than it was at the time. But I think in terms of an at the time one-off raid value, 600, I think it's 625 million from the Axie Infinity Ronin bridge hack that's been attributed to Lazarus Group, I think is probably the biggest single one. But as well, you'll know, and you guys at Chainalysis and other cryptocurrency tracing companies are all over that money, because obviously the joy of cryptocurrency is you can trace it. And so, whilst it's an astonishing amount of money to steal, more than $500 million, as far as I'm aware, I think the last figure I read was something like 18% of that so far has been laundered and potentially cashed out. So there's still a lot of money left to be pulled out by the hackers, and that money is obviously going to be traced, from place to place to place to place. Which is what I go into in the book, that effort to trace the money and keep on top of it. So it's this amazing thing where we have this saying in the UK, you can have your cake, you want to have your cake and eat it. You can have your cake, but you can't eat it, or you can eat it and you're not got any cake. If you're stealing that amount of money, it's great, but then it sits behind glass and you can't get your hands on it. So yeah, you've got $600 million, but you can't spend it.
Yeah, I think some of it's even been retrieved. They were trying to cash some out through.
Yes, Binance.
Yeah, exactly. And Binance was able to see it coming in and froze the accounts before they could flip it back out again. I think there'll be a lot of efforts over the next couple of years to retrieve as much of those funds as they can.
But it's just worth reflecting on that, though, quickly. I mean, if it is, I think I say 18% was the last figure I heard. So let's say it's a fifth of 600 million. So that's just over 100 million, isn't it? That is still more money than they managed to get out of Bangladesh Bank. And the Bangladesh Bank job took at least a year and a half to line up, to do the hacking, to line up all the accounts, to wash the money through casinos, which is another bizarre thing I go into in the book. So, it's an amazing story, but it took so long, a year and a half, and they ended up with in the tens of millions at the end of it. They hit Axie Infinity. Yeah, they don't get the whole $600 million all at once because they can't launder it out, but they get 100 million. So they've already got more than they did in the entire year and a half they spent on Bangladesh Bank. You wonder why they're after cryptocurrency. there's your answer. You get more money quicker.
There's a velocity action there that I think they're not having to go back into real world currency in some ways. Like the electronic nature of it seems to aid the speed of attack potentially. It maybe even lower sophistication of the victims in some cases, right? Like in the Bangladesh bank case, they had to figure out how to compromise a system that basically required you to be in the building with the Swift payment network, where cryptocurrency networks intentionally operate in the open. It's an interesting contrast.
I was just going to say, the ones that you guys have tracked, the ones that we've tracked as journalists, these are simply the high-profile cases that we know about and are attributed to Lazarus Group. One of the hacks we've covered, it's not in the book, but it'll be in series 2 of the podcast, which is going to be out later this year, is a chap who lost $1.5 million. And that's not, obviously, it's nowhere near like the 600 million we've been talking about. Still $1.5 million. That's a stack of money. How many other cases are there like that have just never really been reported? It's $1 million here, it's $1 million there. So the big ones that we know about add up to the billions, but that's ignoring the millions and millions of other dollars that are being made just here and there from attacks that never hit the news, that nobody ever talks about.
This is one of the topics that I think is popular right now in U.S. policy circles, is how do we get better reporting on these cyber incidents? Because I think the government statistics wildly underreport the scale and magnitude of the problem. To your point, Ronin Bridge had to come out because, well, it was $600 million. It kind of collapsed the bridge. There was no opportunity for keeping that one quiet. But I think other companies, they potentially suffer a ransomware attack, and there's strong incentive from a brand reputation perspective to quietly pay the ransom and move on. We certainly are able to see on-chain significantly more payment activity than is officially reported through companies, bringing compromise to light. I'm curious, a moment ago, you touched on the laundering via casino. So there's a huge amount of counterfeit, both currency, pharmaceuticals, and trade happening via North Korea. All that money has to then get brought back into the economy somehow. Cryptocurrency, they're trying to launder that. Like, what does this money laundering apparatus look like?
It's a really good question. Let's start with the end result of it first, because that's probably a good way to think about this. I think I certainly started out when I was writing the book and making the podcast thinking, well, there'll be a sort of end scene to this where Kim Jong-un is rolling around on a bed full of money, banknotes, laughing like some sort of movie villain. But actually, that's not necessarily the case. The ultimate destination of this money, if indeed it has been stolen by North Korea, is not necessarily Pyongyang. Firstly, there's not much stuff to buy in Pyongyang. That's a part of it. But also getting it across the border and moving it into North Korea isn't necessarily the end game. North Korea can sort of keep this money outside its borders in nearby locations, Macau and Hong Kong and so on, or in cryptocurrency wallets can just keep it in a wallet somewhere on the internet and sort of use it as a kind of offshore credit, if you like. It'd be like having a bank account in France if you go on holiday in France that's just full of money, and whenever you go to France, you can just spend it on French stuff because it's all in euros. It's that sort of thing. These stolen funds can become tokens, offshore tokens that can be spent. There's an intriguing case that's being reported at the moment of allegations against a couple of South Koreans working with a North Korean agent, and the North Korean agent was paying them in cryptocurrency. The idea that the money sort of flows back to Pyongyang, in inverted commas, isn't necessarily the case. It's maybe a bit smarter than that. But the laundering that goes on, we need to sort of split, I think, into crypto laundering and non-crypto laundering. The non-crypto laundering stuff, when North Korea is accused of hacking into banks and transferring money out, they need to transfer the money somewhere. They have to launder it. They have to hide the trail. You can't just transfer it back to Kim Jong-un's bank account in Pyongyang. It'd be fairly obvious who committed the crime. So they're constantly searching, as are lots of other cyber crime gangs, cyber operators, for accomplices to work with that can hide the tracks and that can move money around. And this has led them to some really sort of bizarre avenues. So in the Bangladesh bank case, Bangladesh bank's money was in New York. That then got moved by the hackers to a bank in Manila in the Philippines, and then moved into casinos. And the idea of the casinos was that if you convert the money into cash, and we're talking 500 kilos of cash, Philippines pesos, is a grand piano's worth of cash. You then change that into chips. You gamble the chips across the table. You get fresh chips back. You change your chips back into other cash and carry it out the building. Well, an investigator can't link the note that went into the bank to the note that comes out. That's the whole thing. But in order to make that work, you can't just go to the casino table and say, oh, here's my $100 million of chips. Could you give me $100 million of chips back? That's not going to work. They're going to spot. So you have to play the game. You actually have to literally move the money across the table. So if you're remarkably from the hack in Bangladesh, which is all very digital and all very highfalutin and high tech, you end up at frankly with a bunch of dudes in a casino in the Philippines just shoveling chips across the table. That's and what's amazing about that is they did all that and they laundered $81 million through the Philippines, and that took a year, as I say, year and a half of setting up, and it took a month, a solid month of gambling in the casino. They were going to move $951 million, right? More than 10 times as much. They would have had to have spent a solid year shoveling chips across the table to launder. I mean, the idea that they were going to do that is just. If you read the book, there were some interesting quirks about what actually might have been the plan, but I won't go into those. So that's the sort of bank laundering stuff. Oh, the other thing that the North Koreans are accused of getting involved in is laundering money via cash points. So break into a bank, manipulate the cash point system, and get accomplices around the world to withdraw the cash out of the cash points. It's called jackpotting, and that leads them into some really bizarre accomplices. Guy in Canada who's working with an Instagram influencer in Dubai, who's living in the Palazzo Versace hotel, who's helping them organize these bank accounts. Just these incredible sort of linkages. So that's all the accomplices around money laundering and moving money from traditional banking sector. With the crypto side, you've got a similar challenge. You can't just move the money into your wallet. So again, there's been evidence of Lazarus Group hackers being accused of working with accomplices who can change the money into iTunes gift cards or funnel the money through bank accounts, or who can set up accounts at exchanges. So as they've moved targets and moved into the cryptocurrency space, their accomplices have just shifted into people who kind of understand crypto in the same way the guys, lining up the Manila casinos understood, how to work a casino. Same shit, different day, basically.
That's amazing. I think I had heard a story about the ATM cards being distributed across Japan. Sort of low-level organized crime people handed ATM cards and told to go across Tokyo to all sorts of cash point or ATM devices, withdraw a very precise amount that stayed below the transaction monitoring radar, and then all come back at the same time. And that level of coordinated activity is just unbelievable, that a group of people, largely contained within this isolated country, are able to pull this off.
It gets even more insane. I mean, one of the cases I talk about in the book, in fact, it's the opening example in the book because I just found it such an incredible story, was the hacking of Cosmos Bank in India, which is, I think it's the second largest bank in India. It's a huge bank. And again, the hackers gained access to the ATM approval system. And again, they recruited accomplices around the world who could go to cash points with the cards and withdraw money. Um, $11 million gets withdrawn in a window of 2 hours and 13 minutes. Now that's accomplices in the US, Canada, UK, Turkey, Russian Federation, Japan. Well, when it's 10 o'clock in the morning in the US and you're pulling money out, it's the middle of the night in Japan. If you've got a 2 hour window, that's a 2 hour window in every time zone around the world. And so you have to have dudes ready and lined up ready to go. We strongly suspect that these people were recruited through the dark web. According to US Department of Justice allegations, North Korea's used the dark web before for, is on these particular dark web forums. So it makes sense that that's where they'd be finding and recruiting these accomplices. But no, those jackpotting ATM raids are just absolutely astonishing. And then you've got people running around with cash, like literal cash. So what do they do? FedEx it to Pyongyang or something like that. How does the money reconciliation system kind of work? It's really interesting. What we don't know is whether when the hackers broke into the bank, they simply sold on the information to people who then jackpotted it, and it was just a one-time deal, and then the jackpotters keep the money. Or was there some plan that the hackers would break in, give the jackpotters the details, the jackpotters would jackpot the cash points, and then the money would somehow be reconciled back? We don't know. It could have been just a straight one-off deal, and that's clean and effective, but it could have been there was some kind of revenue split worked out later on. That's the level of detail I just don't know and would love to know. Would really love to know.
How these groups come together to collaborate on these elaborate schemes is just fascinating to me. Geoff, I think we're on a tight schedule this morning. I could actually talk to you all day about this stuff. I'm personally fascinated. Thank you from all our listeners for joining us today. The book, give us the title. Where can people find it? When does it come out?
It's called The Lazarus Heist, same as the podcast. It comes out on the 9th of June. In the UK, you can get a physical copy of the book, which looks very lovely. Rest of the world, it is available on audiobook and Kindle. So if you're outside the UK, that's the way to purchase it. And the audiobook is, just to settle this, it is read out by me. I do read out the audiobook. So my dulcet tones will be coming in your ears, as they say.
Outstanding. I can't wait for it. I've got my pre-order in already. And you mentioned season 2 of the podcast is gonna start up soon.
Yes, we are working on that as we speak. I do. Part of me does wish that the Lazarus Group, the allegations against it, would just stop for a while, just so we can catch up. Because it just doesn't. Every time we think, we're ready to finish now and put it all together, something new happens. So that we think later in the year. We're aiming for October-ish, but later in the year. And there's just loads of amazing stories to put in that. So we can't wait to edit that all together. It's going to be huge fun.
Oh, I can't wait for that. It's I'm queued up, subscribed, and ready to go. Geoff, thanks again for your time today. It was terrific. Really enjoyed it.
Ian, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Public Key. We're releasing new episodes weekly, so if you liked what you heard, then don't forget to subscribe, review, and share with your friends. Here's something to think about before the next episode. Among crypto enthusiasts, it's well known there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin created. However, Chainalysis estimates about 3.7 million Bitcoin have already been lost forever, leaving the true amount that could be accessed and sold around 17.3 million. Finally, if you couldn't make it in person to the Chainalysis Links conference, don't worry. You can find links to video recordings of all the amazing content in the show notes.